All right, here we go. Thank you very much. Back to moving. Move those boxes.
I'm getting to
it. 19th of June, alias Juneteenth. Welcome to This and That. It is Juneteenth and a federal holiday in the United States, and I just wanted to do a little commemorative deal to it. It is an example, perhaps, of false consciousness. It's the kind of holiday that, not unlike JFK Jr.'s birthday, is problematic to various folks, I'm sure, although we haven't seen any kind of reaction to it, other than the thing I'm going to bring up right now. And it's mainly about the idea of revisionist history. That is, Juneteenth is not revisionist in the sense that Juneteenth has been sort of celebrated since the 19th of June, 1865, technically. The reality, of course, is that in Texas, nobody knew that they were free for a couple of years. And that's sort of interesting as well. So I've been looking at some revisionist histories. Came across a fellow who is a PhD. Well, he's a historian, sort of, although I think his main degree is in philosophy. He's a graduate of a interdisciplinary program that includes the history of science, among other things. A kind of a wacky guy, considering that he's sort of a part-time academic in a variety of places, and or was, but apparently got a gig doing editing of conservative sort of organizations and websites, and his other side job seems to be coaching the strongest man in the world, which makes for an interesting resume when you read it. Anyway, so this guy wrote a thing trying to not necessarily refute, but essentially, because he's located in Lynchburg, Virginia, probably to accommodate his little website with a variety of other positions on heritage and other white folks stuff and reactionary stuff. So it's just a fascinating little article because it's so, well, he claims there are logical fallacies, but he sort of doubles down on it by essentially using a what's called a fallacy of composition in order to present his critique. And so at the end of his little writing, fairly factual and fairly historical, but his conclusions are weird. So furthermore, the narrative glue of the data is woke. It's one of the first times I've seen the word woke used in a kind of normative sense, mainly because I still don't know what it means. And readers are lectured time and again about white privilege and black penury. That is annoying. He's critiquing a book written by someone. She's either at Yale or it is a Yale University Press book, and the guy was kind of annoyed that it's kind of a critique of slavery. So anyway, that's by way of today talking about Juneteenth. And only last Thursday, I think, the House of Representatives attempted to vote on, and this was a bill introduced by what's his name, Clyde, from the Georgia 9th District, 6th District, whatever. He's a guy who owns a gun store and who does lots of little reactionary things. So this is only one of many stupid things he does. And he's sort of stereotypical in that particular sense, but it was an amendment to reinstate, bring back this little monument here, which is in Arlington National Cemetery. It's a Confederate monument put in 1914, designed by a Jewish guy, the first Jewish graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. And it has interesting, if problematic, sculpture, relief sculpture in it. It is in an area, or it was, they have removed it. It's sitting in a DOD warehouse somewhere, but eventually it could come back. I guess they're not going to destroy it. So anyway, it's a monument to Confederate soldiers, and it used to sit in Arlington National Cemetery until it got removed. It has in it a sort of tableau of relief elements here, all quite nicely done in a late 19th century, early 20th century style. You can see all the things that make it kind of a nice piece of sculpture in the same tradition of all 19th century, late 19th century sculptures. And you can see that the problematic one, of course, is a quote unquote mammy figure, with what some claim to be, and I'm not sure that it's necessarily so, but a white. The claim is that that's a white baby with a Confederate soldier there who is they've identified as the father. So this is all, some of the iconographic or iconological problems of this piece of sculpture, which, it may not necessarily be problematic. It's certainly a product of its time, sort of its time. Anyway, so it was recommended to remove it. And the middle position, written by some other folks, is, well, you can sort of use it to tell the story of how both the Lee Plantation and the story of African Americans, it did have slaves on it, needless to say, during the Civil War era and especially Reconstruction, was erased from public memory. Reconstruction did have a kind of erasure built into it, that is the first Reconstruction, and requiring ostensibly a second Reconstruction, and as the Reverend Barber suggested, a third Reconstruction is sort of needed. So this one other fellow, not the same one I was talking about, suggested a kind of liberal position. We can remove the monument from the cemetery landscape, but use it to help visitors understand how it evolved over time in a more appropriate museum setting. That's usually the middle position on most of the Confederate monuments. But what's interesting, of course, is that the Southern Poverty Law Center decided to identify where all the darn things were, all the Confederate monuments were. They're not all in the South. There's even a couple in California, for example. And it's just interesting because it has a history of a variety of reasons for putting up monuments, that is for commemoration, for memorialization, for grieving, but as I think you can imagine, the complexity of reasons is really a feature, not a bug in these kinds of ideas. Anyway, so the thing is still removed, but almost 200 House Republicans voted Thursday, this was last Thursday, I think, to reinstall a Confederate memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. All of the House GOP leadership, including House Speaker Mike Johnson and Representative Lee Stefanik, voted for the measure. Representative Byron Donalds, a Black conservative and Donald Trump surrogate who took heat this month for seeming to praise aspects of the Jim Crow era, voted for it as well. Stefanik and Donalds have been mentioned as possible vice presidential picks for Trump. The amendment, which was part of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2024, failed 2030 to 192 after 24 Republicans sided with Democrats in voting against it. Most Republicans, for example, Representatives Wesley Hunt, Republican from Texas, and Burgess Owens, Republican from Utah, who are Black, supported the amendment proposed by Representative Andrew Clyde, who I just mentioned, Republican of Georgia. No Democrats did. The memorial was removed in December after a years-long congressional effort to remove Confederate names and statues from military installations across the country. The amendment would have returned the memorial, which is in storage in a Defense Department facility in Virginia, to its original spot in the cemetery. The 32-foot bronze statue depicted, among other images, an enslaved Black woman described on the cemetery website as a quote-unquote mammy figure, holding the white child of a Confederate officer and an enslaved black man following his Confederate enslaver into battle, according to the cemetery. Plans for the statue began in 1906. Called both the Reconciliation Monument and the Arlington Confederate Memorial, it was sculpted by Moses Ezekiel, a Confederate veteran and the first Jewish graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, according to the cemetery website. It was installed in 1914, almost 50 years after the Civil War ended, by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in a ceremony attended by President Woodrow Wilson, who was noted even at that time for his racist views. This was a memorial to men who committed treason in defense of the supposed right of some humans to own other humans as property. James Grossman, executive director of the American Historical Association, said when the statue was removed. The offices of Donalds, Johnson, and Stefanik did not respond to requests for comment. Previous House Speaker Kevin McCarthy voted several times to remove the Confederate statues. Remember, Kevin's from California, from federal property, including the U.S. Capitol. At a Trump campaign event this month in Philadelphia, Donalds blamed a supposed decline in Black family values on Democratic policies during the Civil Rights era. You see, during Jim Crow, the Black family was together, he said. During Jim Crow, more Black people were not just conservative. Black people have always been conservative-minded, but more Black people voted conservatively. And then HEW, the former federal Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, Lyndon Johnson, you go down that road, and now we are where we are. In other words, he's complaining about the ostensive second period of Reconstruction after the Civil Rights Act. Later, in an MSNBC interview with Joy Reid, Donalds denied that he'd cast the Jim Crow era in a positive light, saying he was speaking only about marriage rates and claiming those higher marriage rates meant Black fathers were there to protect their families. Reid pushed back, saying racist laws and racial terror of the period meant Black men couldn't protect their families from assault or lynching, and noting that in Donald's home state of Florida, a Black boy named Willie James Howard was lynched in front of his father in 1944. Donald's comments were widely condemned, including by House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, a Democrat of New York, who called them an outlandish, outrageous, and out-of-pocket observation. With an interesting reference. On Friday, Jeffries criticized all House Republicans who voted for the Confederate Memorial Amendment, saying, "What tradition are extreme MAGA Republicans upholding? What Confederate tradition are you upholding? Is it slavery, rape, kidnap, Jim Crow, lynching, racial oppression, or all of the above?" The amendment was one of many proposed by Republicans as part of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2024. Others targeted diversity programs and access to abortion and transgender health care for service members and their families. Arlington National Cemetery, which holds the remains of service members from a number of conflicts, began as a Union cemetery during the Civil War. It is located on a commandeered plantation previously owned by Confederate General Robert E. Lee. In 1900, during the Jim Crow era, Congress authorized the remains of Confederate soldiers to be reinterred there. So, you can see that would in fact be problematic, considering that any Confederate soldier would essentially be a traitor. But that's the sort of thing. So this is how the voting went on the amendment. 24 Republicans voting against, 5 not voting, 5 Republicans not voting, 10 Democrats not voting. You can see there's a lot of wishy-washiness going on. So what's the history of Juneteenth? On June 19, 1865, a Union general read General Order Number 3 aloud, informing the people of Galveston, Texas, it's on the coast, that below Houston, as decreed by President Abraham Lincoln, all slaves are free. Though the Emancipation Proclamation was signed more than 2 years earlier, June 19th, thus the portmanteau Juneteenth, is usually considered the day that the last enslaved Black people in the Confederacy finally learned of their freedom. Black Texans have celebrated the date since 1866, and the tradition slowly migrated to other portions of the South. By the end of the 20th century, it had eventually stretched into communities throughout the country. This mainly because of the Great Migration. Since then, activists and legislators have worked for decades to obtain national recognition for it. For a nation that generally accepts the perpetuation of chattel slavery as its greatest shortfall, a sin so egregious that it fractured the nation and spurred the bloodletting of its deadliest war, marking the demise of slavery, makes perfect sense. It signals the terribleness of the thing, the lengths to which the nation went to fight for its eradication, and the progress America has made from what it once was to what it aspires to be. Juneteenth is a civic reminder to pause and appreciate how far the nation has come. If Independence Day on July 4th is a day to honor all that the nation got right, Juneteenth is a call to always right the things it gets wrong. If only our politics were so pure. This is the Brennan Center's from the Brennan Center site. Now, it's more interesting to think of it as a much larger sort of question. And so I asked Gemini, the AI for Google, about the political economy of Juneteenth, and it has a legacy of disparity. It's about emancipation, and it's not about equality. Juneteenth marked the end of slavery, but not economic freedom for Black Americans. They were denied land ownership, fair wages, and access to capital that white families enjoyed. This continues to affect wealth distribution today. It has broken promises. Reconstruction efforts to integrate Black citizens were short-lived. Jim Crow laws and discriminatory practices further limited economic mobility. Now, the contemporary issues are there's a racial wealth gap. Black families have a fraction of the wealth compared to white families, limiting opportunities for education, homeownership, and business ventures. It signifies unequal access in some ways, Black communities often face higher rates of poverty, unemployment, and predatory lending practices. And there are calls to action related to this that represent the kind of problems that are not fixed by certain types of commemoration. Closing the gap. Policies like reparation or targeted investments in Black communities are proposed to address the wealth gap. Economic empowerment initiatives promoting Black business ownership and financial literacy are gaining traction. And then there are political considerations, of which Juneteenth is an example. Symbolic recognition, making Juneteenth a federal holiday, is a step towards acknowledging the economic disadvantages faced by Black Americans. Electoral politics recognition of Juneteenth can be seen as a way to acknowledge the growing Black electorate. However, there's debate on its effectiveness. Overall, Juneteenth serves as a reminder of the ongoing fight for economic justice as the day to celebrate freedom while acknowledging the need to dismantle the economic legacies of slavery and discrimination. Now, I asked it a subsequent question about why did it take so long for it to be recognized in Texas? And there's several reasons for, the 2 years gap and limited union presence. That is, the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Lincoln in 1863 only applied to Confederate states that were actively in rebellion. So you can argue Texas wasn't, and therefore Texas, being far west, wasn't under significant Union military control for most of the Civil War. This meant that the news of emancipation and enforcement of the proclamation didn't readily reach the enslaved people in the state. It also sort of represents Confederate control of information. The Confederate government actively suppressed news of the Emancipation Proclamation, fearing it would demoralize their troops and encourage slaves to escape. Texan newspapers continued to advertise slaves for sale even after the war officially ended in 1865. It also represented communication delays. The vast distances within Texas and the limited communication infrastructure of the time likely contributed to the slow spread of the news. Continued power dynamics, even after the Union victory, many slaveholders in Texas likely resisted acknowledging emancipation and may have tried to keep their slaves in bondage. Juneteenth is a celebration. The day commemorating the announcement of emancipation in Texas isn't widely celebrated outside of the Black community initially. It took time for awareness and recognition to spread throughout the state and the nation. And there are other additional points to consider. Accounts of enslaved people in Texas learning about emancipation through whispers, rumors, or the arrival of Union soldiers. Juneteenth became a powerful symbol of freedom and resilience for Black Texans, even as they continued to struggle for full equality. And it wasn't until recently in 2021 that Juneteenth became a federal holiday. In conclusion, the delayed knowledge of emancipation in Texas stemmed from a combination of factors, including limited Union presence, Confederate information control, this is very AI-oriented, communication limitations, and the persistence of power dynamics that favored slaveholders. Note that there's no word called racism sort of built in there. Juneteenth serves as a reminder of the ongoing fight for racial justice and the importance of celebrating freedom. Racial wealth and income gaps are just the tip of the iceberg, from predatory lending practices and housing and education to a tax code that privileges the white wealthy, to policy barriers to dignified work, to an exploitative criminal justice system. These are not standalone problems. They are the consequences of an interconnected web of historical and contemporary rules that hold people calling back. So, and it continues on in talking about wage gaps and disproportionate union membership. And just a very simple example here, the combination of redlining neighborhoods and the government's willingness to allow telecom companies to behave like monopolies has resulted in the exclusion of Black communities from broadband investments and contributed to a growing digital divide. Without broadband access, people living in those communities face barriers to activities that are fundamental to economic participation, like applying for a job, doing homework, applying to college, to name just a few. This last section is written by the Roosevelt Institute, one of the very few left-wing think tanks. And that was written in 2019. And here is the chart or diagram indicating the kind of production, as it were, of Confederate monuments that rise in the period immediately after the end of Civil War and begins to decline during the Depression, rises slightly in the second Reconstruction or the Civil Rights Act period. We can imagine that that might be a reaction to some people. And then, of course, there's a slight jump a little bit later on, but generally it's pretty much the same rate of construction as just immediately after the Civil War. So it has a path. Now, I won't read this whole thing by this one little fellow, but it is interesting how he sort of frames it as that there's only one argument being presented by this little piece at the Southern Poverty Law Center on monuments. The report was based on undocumented sources. No, there were documented sources, but the charting of monuments and namesakes was used to make the claim that the rise of Confederate monuments was attributed to Jim Crow racism. Thus, the fallacy was born, a fallacy that is easily refuted by even a cursory examination of readily available source material. Well, I would agree. Our little fellow here with his PhD made a very cursory examination of and very problematic historical argument. He says that without getting into the details, there were monuments in the North and they weren't monuments to slavery, and there are monuments to the war. Racism or slavery is never explicitly mentioned on any monument. So therefore, it can't, it has all these little heritage arguments that are built into, why we make monuments. And I think it can be unspoken that there was slavery and racism somehow involved in the Civil War. But he uses the fact of their absence as an argument that perhaps that's not the real reason, or that there's something problematic about making claims that Jim Crow is involved. It does parallel the rise of Jim Crow laws. And so if you go into, if you make an argument about the Jim Crow laws, they occur exactly at the same time as the rise of monuments. It's not unusual. And if you look at the activity of various interest groups, the citizens committees, the Daughters of the Confederacy, all of those folks, they're all that's all part of that. But his veritable specious argument assumes that Civil War was about Civil War and it wasn't about any other other issues. So it in effect, it's a what about sort of argument, and sort of specious but amusing. And the claim is the real reason, making the truth claim that it is the real reason for Civil War monuments. Now, it is, of course, also interesting to see that there are 772 Confederate monuments still in the United States, and this is their distribution all the way up into Pennsylvania and, bizarrely enough, in Montana and California, and a little bit in Iowa. So you can see generally certain ideas are at work in many of these states. Obviously, you're going to have more in places like Georgia or Virginia and the Deep South. And you can, make all kinds of comments about how, what these things begin to look like in the period, in the monument movement period. I apologize, it's not my spelling error here. But there is this period that is the early and late Reconstruction periods, as well as all of the other problematic things that go on up through and including World War I, and you can see all of these little elements at work. You could argue, in fact, that Confederate monuments piggyback on the desire to do war monuments in general, that is World War I monuments, and a variety of other reasons. And and yes, there is Jim Crow. That some people like to ignore Jim Crow's presence, but frankly, there are more monuments than just monuments to Jim Crow. And I included a little video here on Juneteenth to Vox one among many. Why is it that Americans should honor Juneteenth? And it's very short, and I can probably show that.
Juneteenth is a deeply emotional moment for enslaved people because for decades, for centuries, enslaved people prayed for, hoped for, fought for in the form of slave rebellions, running away, bought their freedom when they could. And if you read slave narratives, if you listen to spirituals from the era of slavery, you know that enslaved people longed for freedom. This was something that had been hoped for, but many believe may never come.
Well, the water is promised to give me $40 a month in fed. Well, lots of the boys say they ain't want it. They rather go free,
Being able to go wherever they wanted, being able to wonder about. For enslaved people, it was an expression of their freedom.
Well, that photo was the one that long Miss photo, one of our white folks made. He come along, we all sitting on the fence, and the colored soldier come along and asked her, did she want to go with him? And she said yes, she mounted one of them horses. She went on with them. I never did see her and hear tell of her no more.
When I think about Juneteenth, I think about it in the context of Emancipation Day celebrations that began January 1, 1863. They took on a whole new meaning when slavery was formally abolished after 1865. You would have had African-American veterans who fought in the Civil War be prominent in these celebrations, dressed in their military garb, speeches from enslaved people, the most prominent Black politicians singing of hymns, spirituals, discussions of registering to vote. Enslaved people celebrating in public their newfound freedom was an act of resistance. Because we have to remember slavery came to an end after a 4 years bloody civil war. Still the bloodiest conflict in American history. Many people in the South and in the nation who did not want to see slavery abolished fought tooth and nail to block the 13th Amendment. The abolition of slavery created a huge humanitarian crisis in the South. Suddenly, 4 million people have very little means to take care of themselves, to support themselves, and do so in a really hostile environment. So the military was necessary to make sure that enslaved people got the food, the medicine, the shelter that they needed in order to survive. They're also there to protect, to the extent that that was possible, freed people from violence, from recriminations, from slaveholders, from Confederates who still hadn't given up the fight.
And I remember when the Yankees stopped here, and the Yankees stopped back on the corner of Square, and they prosecuted people, you know. We go to the ground scene, and they take them, hang them over the storm. That's the punishment they got. Next time you see, they come a whole troop of Yankees, all riding horses, big guns hanging on. And I said, Mama, where are they going? They're all going home now.
When the last federal troops leave the South, it's a signal to Southerners. The federal government wasn't going to put its might into ensuring the civil rights of Black people would be observed. You have 20, 30 years later, Black people being lynched in public, and there isn't a federal anti-lynching law to protect them. In most communities in America, there's a history of lynching and racial violence, and very few communities have marked that, commemorated that. Every decade since the end of slavery, Black people have been more educated, accrued more wealth, more status in American society. Every decade since 1865. But there's been one constant, and that constant is the presence of random racist violence. What I see in George Floyd's murder was a white police officer attempting to dominate and to subdue a Black man who was not resisting, who could not resist. Even though slavery came to an end in 1865, the desire to master and dominate Black bodies did not. And we have never dealt with that. These are the kinds of stark realities that are highlighted during Juneteenth. If Black people's lives can be expunged through racist violence and no one is held accountable, how free are we? Are we free?
Okie doke. Thank you for listening to my little yammering today. And close to the end of my little time here. Are there any questions or comments? Love to hear them. Let's look at the chat. The big cowards who lost. Yeah, monuments to cowardice. Indeed they are.
Where'd that guy get his PhD?
Hmm?
Where'd that guy get his PhD?
Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh.
I just like to comment, we've come a long way, baby.
I mean, the fact that, I think the Republicans knew they weren't going to get that amendment to restore the monument, but they did want to virtue signal to particularly southern states, red states, that which side they were on. And that's sort of interesting, more interesting.
Did you say there was over 200 that voted
Yes.
for it?
230.
Me.
Or 192. Let's put it that way. 192, whatever.
And it's sort of surprising that they would go on record with that.
You're saying it's not surprising, right, Larry?
Well, yeah, I guess it's.
I mean, yeah, they know their base. They know what they like and what they approve of. I mean,
I mean, they're just doing every kind of expression except saying the actual words, waving the actual Nazi flag or the Confederate flag.
One's a proxy for the other, and that's also amusing. That's virtue signaling. You could sort of get away in certain places of waving the Confederate flag, where waving the Nazi flag would get you into trouble with everybody.
Shit, man, we got the Confederate flag here in Norway. Just because the Nazis are the one that's illegal.
Okay. No other questions or interventions. We can stop and move on to other matters. I will thank everyone for their.
I had a question.
Oh, please.
Yes, so I just wondered, it's kind of abstract, but where does the situation we have today lie vis-a-vis the Clower-Piven theory?
The what?
Clower and then
Yes.
Pivin. It
I
was
don't know. You could.
Frances Fox Piven and her husband, I believe.
Yes. Well, I don't know what you're mentioning this in reference to.
Well, it was the idea that these two people, Clower and a lady named Piven, back in the 60s, came up with this notion that the only way to get social change was to rise up and raise so much hell that
Yes.
you couldn't be ignored.
Yes. Yes, I know what you're referring to.
Yeah, and then it's been it's called the Cloward, CLOWARD-PIVEN strategy. And I've heard some people talking about it now as though it has some relevance. It doesn't seem like it would to me. I just wondered if you'd heard any scuttlebutt about.
No, I think it sits more in historical context relative to the 60s. It's used as a slight argument when there was this issue, as I've mentioned before, time on the cross, that is the revisionist history of the profitability of slavery, which people were annoyed by. But, the reality is it did have a certain degree of profitability, and, the ending slavery for X reason is always this sort of minutia that people want to argue about. which distracts from the reality of it, the whole question of the need to do it, period, as a mark of being civilized. and the Americans, of course, it took us another 30 some odd years to after the British to get rid of slavery, or at least on paper.
I see. Okay, yeah, I was just curious. It's so far back there. I wondered if there was any people clinging to it as a way to explain anything.
Oh, it doesn't explain anything so much as there is a sentiment. It's an accelerationist view, and accelerationist views have always been there. Some people still, hope that contradictions will rise, and that will, you get a crisis, and maybe things will change in a radical way. It certainly was the expectation of many groups in the 1930s, and of course, Europe showed us that actually could happen in the interwar period, and to our great dismay.
It says the strategy is an 8-step plan designed in 1966 by hardcore anti-American liberal socialists. Of course, this is an article by somebody else. Hardcore anti-American liberal socialists Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven that called for an overloading of U.S. public welfare system in order to precipitate a crisis that would lead to a replacement of the welfare system with a new national system. Here's their plan. Look at it and tell me if you see anything that it mentions that might be happening now. I think they were shooting for a guaranteed minimum income or something back in the day. And the people I know in Kentucky, my relatives, they consider any government handout, including, I guess, welfare or anything that would allow impoverished blacks to turn down a job offer from a white person at very low wages. That irritates the hell out of the white people. They say, all those people won't work for us anymore. They won't get out in the field and work for us. Well, I wouldn't either.
Well, this is with respect to kind of old, racist models, this is it seems stereotypic, but actually, still sits there as a trope. It's a Republican trope, certainly. But it's sort of stupid in the sense that there's, far too much irregularity to make even arguments like that, considering that relative to a quote unquote social welfare system, there are more whites on social welfare than there are black people. This is the numbers. And including, for example, people on unemployment, et cetera, white people are the majority on these in these programs, et cetera. So any arguments about black people are just simply racism. It's just
that sounds right.
Always amazing.
Yeah. That sounds right.
Well, when I worked in Pennsylvania, I was, located in a city, but much of my outreach work was into the rural areas, and it was amazing how much higher, unemployment rates and et cetera, are in the vast middle of Pennsylvania, and it's white folks, it's not black folks who are part of the data, and that's interesting and problematic, and filled with the kind of false consciousness that you see appealed to in politics in Pennsylvania, for example.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks.
I thank you for mentioning it, because there is a kind of one could argue, and I'm not saying that this is why they believe that, but there are Afrocentric beliefs that do subscribe in a kind of really weird Clarence Thomas sort of way that you should support Trump because it'll chaos will occur, and maybe things will get turned around faster.
Okay, well, thank you for your comments on that. I just heard of it today, so I was wondering, what is this?
Well, there is a tradition of reactionary, sort of black consciousness that is a resistance to the kind of machine politics that you see that was sort of developed by the Democratic Party in the interwar period and up through, the purge or end of the Dixiecrats, et cetera. So that, democratic machine politics in urban areas, for black folks is of a certain type. It's the thing that Barack Obama was engaged in terms of quote unquote community organizing. And with all due respect, there is a black reaction to that has kind of this kind of false consciousness built into a certain kind of ideology about it, where on the one hand, they, everyone, they do other things in terms of the culture, but in terms of certain policy and voting, they kind of veer towards conservative, a white conservative position in a kind of very weird way. And whether they're doing it for vanguard purposes, that is, accelerationist purposes to bring the whole system down, I don't know, but it that's where it kind of has this weird kind of a syncretic overlap with Trumpist, sort of stuff, anti-government stuff. You can see that, right?
Yeah.
Black Republicans, and that's why this guy Donald's and Tim Scott. I mean, I think every normal person would go, "What the hell is that all about?" Sucking up to Trump, it's just like so weird. But yet they exist, and you can see them right in front of us, right?
Yeah, this article I'm looking at right here, it's by Prepare for Change, which sounds like a quasi-Christian, crypto-Christian outfit here.
Yeah.
But of the steps, it says, number one, healthcare, take control, or control healthcare and you control the people. That's happening now. Poverty, increase the poverty level as high as possible. Poor people are easy to control and will not fight back if you're providing everything for them to live. That's happening now. Debt, number three, increase debt up to an unsustainable level. That way you're able to increase taxes, and this will produce more poverty. Happening now. I'm not quite sure of the logic in that one, but and then four is gun control. Remove the ability to defend yourselves from the government. That way you'll be able to create a police state. Happening now. Welfare, take control of every aspect of their lives, food, housing, and income. I think that is happening. These private equity firms want to own everything and will own nothing and will rent everything and so on. Number six, education, take control of what people read and listen to us. Take control of what children learn in school, already done. Religion, remove belief in God from the government and schools, already done. Class warfare, divide is number eight, the last one. Divide the people into wealthy and poor. This will cause more discontent and will be easier to tax the wealthy with the support of the poor. Happening now. Well, good luck on that one.
Well, but I think you can see that from a theoretical point of view, that this is why some people promote these horseshoe theories that left authoritarianism is the same as right authoritarianism. Well, that's just not true. But you can see that some people in an accelerationist way want the antagonisms, like I was talking about before, is to raise the antagonisms so that you would have, exacerbate the class conflicts, etc. And that's a revolutionary model. It's just as you can see with the in the context of the interwar period in Germany, you might not win, and bad things would happen. Really bad things can happen. This is the issue of the Social Democrats versus the Communists versus the Nazis, right?
Yeah.
And you see who won, and you see what havoc occurred. And we're still fighting. We still fight it in, Ukraine, whatever is still about that. And even Israel Gaza still has components of it, which is it's just crazy making. But you can see that underlying those arguments are a variety of things that could be construed as left positions. That is, raise the contradictions up to the point where we would overthrow the government, blah 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 blah. it'd be nice if you could do it in a formulaic way, but I think, and this is the whole point of the Frankfurt School, et cetera, is to go, well, you get, conflict, but antagonism, but you can't guarantee it's going to go in the right direction.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well-
I mean, if you were going to be really serious about it, you go, oh, well, let's see, from a tactical point of view, you really, strategic point of view, you need to probably need to take over the army. That's one thing, or I mean, the military, and there's a whole bunch of other things that have to happen, and that's not, it's just difficult in this country to have that happen.
Yeah.
And at a populist point of view, just because you're going to free up more guns doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to, we're going to have we probably will have January 6th all over again. And it's unfortunate, but I think that's probably going to happen again.
Mm-hmm. Oh. And parenthetically, did you notice the end of the 50-year agreement with Saudi Arabia? The petrodollar?
Oh, yes.
That seems like fairly significant. It's like,
well, we're in this weird period, and it's more complicated than that. I mean, it has to do with a whole bunch of other things, the way the market is constructed, and then you've got this weirdness between China and Russia, and then Russia's own machinations with shipping oil around and skirting the rules. Really problematic. It's a really screwed up market.
mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you, Ann. I'll just sit back here and see what else happens. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for bringing it up, though. I think that's always underlying certain things, like tankies will, insist that, anything that helps a class struggle is going to work. But I mean, there is a class struggle. There's going to be a class struggle. But the question is, if you push it in certain directions, it's not necessarily going to wind up in the right place. You might actually wind up doing worse things.
Yeah, that sort of gets to my question. Is there like a Marxist or a capitalist critique analysis of the Civil War, and what happened in the direct aftermath of it? I would think that
the all of the stuff on antebellum and postbellum, the Reconstruction stuff is really interesting history. And lest you think that's unimportant, when you have Ted Cruz during the period on January 6th, where he and Josh Hawley, because they're senators, allow the vote to go through, allow the House vote to the voting on the overthrow of the government, of trying to send the reconsider the votes, whatever. Ted Cruz, in his little floor speech, talks about the 1876 election, which is, to me, and this is my little shibboleth, but it is the moment where, and it is part of the potential plan, and it underwrites part of the original John Eastman plan, where you throw the election into the House and therefore gain the benefit of having majority GOP legislatures, which is essentially what happened in the 1876 election. Several states refused to provide their electoral college votes, I think, and so that's what fucked it up. And then you had all these things going on. Then you had essentially a backroom deal, which forced, because of the deal, Tilden Hayes, giving Hayes the election also included removing troops from the South. Hence, ending in 1877 Reconstruction.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I guess that there's just shenanigans on January 6th right?
This
That
can still
doesn't seem
happen in this can still happen in 2025. That's all I'm saying.
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
If you have a couple of states, likely red states, southern states, I mean, a blue state could do it. I mean, the point is that you just, you sort of fuck up the process so that it forces the vote into a place where the GOP can, turn it over.
Right. Cheat.
It's cheating.
Oh my God.
It's rigging
Yeah.
the election. God. I can't remember how many states, but there were about 3 states in 1876 that, Devin, we're still counting our votes, or we gonna, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Thereby fucking up the electoral college, certifying the vote.
I'm glad they didn't do anything to rectify that situation.
Well, the Electoral Count Act was still fucked up for another decade, and we only just fixed it with the latest version, or whatever the fuck it was, 2 years ago, 3 years ago.
Yeah, but we still have the electoral college, and we still have the
Yes,
provision that
absolutely.
puts
It's only it was a band-aid, but at least it provided procedures so that this little business about the leather boxes with the votes in them coming into the floor of the House, that all that bullshit is purely ceremonial now, as opposed to the John Eastman reading of it that, oh well, no, the vice president could overthrow the entire government, whatever.
I mean, the way it should be done is, of course, by popular vote. And if any state or locality decides to withhold votes, then you go in and you arrest the people that are withholding the votes because they're committing a crime, or they certainly should be.
Well, that degree of detail was not in the new.
Well, that's the problem. It's not like we haven't had time to think about this.
Well, geez, yeah, especially since we actually have trials going on now where, you call in the state trooper who was standing at the door when the fake GOP electors in Michigan said, well, why won't you let us in? And he's going, well, I don't think I'm supposed to let you in. You don't belong here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like sobering when you realize something like those Brooks Brothers clowns can,
oh God,
change
what a joke.
Change an outcome. Yeah.
What a fucking joke. I mean, that whole thing is just a mess, top to bottom. I mean, it's embarrassing as a registered Democrat. I go, why the fuck did they do it that way? That was just like, I can't forget.
Family show. There goes our YouTube child rating.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Good.
Damn it. Gosh darn it.
I was a bit confused up front, probably because I'm exhausted from moving all of this. But could you clarify I misunderstood the fact that Juneteenth is perceived as revisionist history, but it's not, technically not. I didn't quite follow that. People think that it hasn't been celebrated since the end of slavery or something.
Well, it was under acknowledged. Let's put it that way. Juneteenth, hardly anyone mentions Juneteenth. Juneteenth was under acknowledged even up through the civil rights era.
So is it criticized as being revisionist history and therefore invalid, or
no, it's just that it's an actual event. I mean, it's just that it was sort of under acknowledged, and you can see that there was problems with it. That is that the Texans, obviously wanted to keep hold of their property, didn't want to give it up for 2 years and didn't have to in some ways, simply because of the, chaos. You're not going to go back in and arrest people, but, they probably should have. That's all. It's not revisionist history. I was identifying some pieces of revisionist history that sort of go to the issue of, oh, well, maybe we should get rid of the, the constitutional amendment for whatever reason. I mean, there's like all kinds of people who want to do that, There are other revisionists, right? There are people who want to get rid of the 14th Amendment. Let's see, what else? There's several amendments they want to get rid of. That are just they could call them, certain due process protections are unnecessary to guarantee.
Well, I think there's like a right-wing nutjob sentiment that, Juneteenth is an effort by Black people to take over the 4th of July or something like that. That.
Oh, I just look at it. That's not what it's supposed to do. It just celebrates the fact that it celebrates the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. God damn it.
Hands off my bottle rockets.
Look at it from a capitalist point of view, because to sell more fireworks.
Right. Yeah.
Except you're selling them to Black people, and that's an issue for some people.
Yeah, you got to make them so they make loud noises, but they can't
They get blood
actually buildings. Yeah, right.
So we call it a day for the live stream.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right.
Move on to other matters. Thank you very much for coming to This and That. We'll have something different tomorrow. I just thought, it's Juneteenth. I might as well put something together that we can learn a little bit more about it and see that it's still pretty relevant, considering the kind of hanky-panky that's going on in Washington.